Hey everyone, I'm excited to share a brand new interview with you, and I've never done this before. For the intro to this month's episode, I'm going to replay the intro to a previous episode. It just fits too well not to do this. And it's an intro that I've always really liked, so if you haven't heard it before, I'm excited for you to listen. This month, we're talking about immigration opinions, and back in 2022, I produced a short intro story for an episode about using entertainment to change prejudices. And that story was about this great radio series from the 30s called Americans All, Immigrants All. And it's still a timely reminder of the United States' complicated history with immigration. So I'll play that now and see you in a few minutes to introduce this month's guest.
Hail to America and liberty, hail the story and the glory of democracy.
The American story, or like the story of modern America and its inhabitants, is an immigrant story. People coming to this land in waves from all over the world in search of an opportunity and a better life. For years after the United States were established, immigrants came with relatively little oversight. But several years after World War I, in 1923, when Calvin Coolidge first addressed the country as its president, he said, "America must be kept American. For this purpose, it is necessary to continue a policy of restricted immigration." And in 1924, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act, which severely restricted immigration. Then, in 1929, the stock market crashed, throwing the country into turmoil. And as political scientist Susan Herbst writes about this time, as is often the case with racism, long-held discriminatory attitudes toward immigrants and their children were rekindled as economic hardship brought out the worst in many. But during this time of anti-immigrant prejudice and questions about what it means to be a true American, a bold radio program burst through the fog. From November 1938 until May 1939, during the coveted Sunday afternoon time slot, the CBS network aired a 26-part series called
Americans All, Immigrants All.
According to a printed booklet that you could get by writing to the U.S. Office of Education,
Send in your request for the free booklet today.
Americans All, Immigrants All was designed to promote a more appreciative understanding of our growing American culture through the dramatization of the contributions made by the many groups which are part of it. The episodes featured entertaining and informative peeks into the experiences of
The Irish immigrant, Germans in the United States,
the Scandinavians and the Finns,
Greeks, Turks, and Syrians, Slavs in the United States, Orientals, the French-speaking people and the Netherlanders, Italians in America.
Also, even though it's kind of awkwardly shoehorned in there, the series also features an episode focused on African Americans.
Today we bring you the story of one immigrant who did not come of his own free will, the Negro. Brought here as slaves for nearly 200 years, emancipated only 75 years ago, the Negroes were and are a challenge to democracy and an important part of our economic and social development.
These episodes feature brief history lessons, short radio dramas where native-born Americans meet immigrants and realize their assumptions about them were wrong, and examples of immigrants who have accomplished great things. The series was a concerted effort to counter anti-immigrant attitudes, driven in large part by the efforts of a teacher from New Jersey, Rachel Davis Du Bois. She was a passionate social activist, advocating for immigrants and minorities, and in the 1930s, she connected with John Studebaker, who had been appointed as U.S. Commissioner of Education and who led the Federal Radio Education Committee. Together, they conceived of a radio program that would reach the masses and educate them on the struggles of immigrants in order to increase tolerance. They first went to NBC, who rejected it, fearing that it would be unpopular and offensive to celebrate immigrants' contributions to the United States, as though they might be even more important than those of white people born here. And it wasn't perfectly smooth sailing once CBS signed on either. The producers originally wanted to call the series Immigrants All, but that got changed to Immigrants All, Americans All, to emphasize that this wasn't just about advocating for immigrants, it was about everybody's role. But then, the title got changed yet again to Americans All, Immigrants All, because after all, when the title would get abbreviated in radio listings, Americans All just has a better ring to it than Immigrants All, don't you think? Nevertheless, I think it's pretty remarkable that we had a program like this in the 1930s, complete with live orchestral music, a professional host, and scripts read by actors, all with this progressive goal to address intolerance. And sure, when you listen now, it probably doesn't pass all the criteria for politically correct progressive advocacy. But to their credit, they had consultants from immigrant rights agencies give feedback on scripts and flag potentially problematic content. So, did Americans all, immigrants all, change public opinion? Well, that's hard to know. Nobody was really testing the effects at the time, and now, more than 80 years later, it's hard to find a clear record, but we have some indications that it may have made a difference. Remember, I mentioned that you could write in to request a booklet based on the program. Well, in 1941, for her master's thesis, one graduate student poured over 81,000 such requests. And sure, most of them just said, like, can I please have this booklet? But some of them came with additional comments, and she seemed to find that many Americans were moved by the radio series, some even expressing that they wished everyone in the country would be required to listen to it. Then again, these may just be the very people who never had strong anti-immigrant attitudes to begin with, so we're left with a question. Can infotainment, like Americans All, Immigrants All, and the way various media portray people from different social groups, can it really break through and change hearts and minds? Perhaps even by conveying that respect and tolerance are the norm. You're listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how we talk about them. I'm Andy Luttrell, and this month I'm excited to share my conversation with Alex Kustov. Alex is an associate professor of global affairs at the University of Notre Dame. He studies public opinion, particularly about immigration. He recently released a book covering some of his research on this topic called In Our Interest: How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. He also writes the Substack Popular By Design. We talk about the state of public opinion regarding immigration, the dilemma at the center of people's opinions on this issue, and what sorts of policy and advocacy moves could shift people's views. Along the way, Alex offers a pragmatic perspective on what is often a morally loaded debate. So let's jump into my conversation with Alex Kustov. Yeah, let's start with just like setting the foundation for public opinion on immigration as an issue. My sense is that this is sort of a topic area about which you are interested in attitudes and shaping them, right? And so this is sort of a domain in which you've done a lot of work. And so just sort of like paint a picture of what that landscape looks like and what it's revealing to us about like fruitful avenues to try to pursue to make change or to better understand where people are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's important to kind of understand the descriptive picture first, right, of what is happening right now. And I think in just a few words, the state of current public opinion on immigration in the U.S. is not great. I'm not just saying this as someone who has come to believe that immigration can be a good thing. I think, we're just being oscillating back and forth between backlash to backlash to backlash with no kind of constructive policy making in sight on the issue, right? And obviously there's a lot of nuance, but I think the most honest summary right now is that immigration is an increasingly salient issue where I think almost everyone has an opinion about it, right? And it's increasingly polarized issue by party. And it's also increasingly thermostatic. And we can talk more about what it means later, I guess, today. But at the same time, we also know that kind of making pro-immigration policies of any kind has been and still is decidedly unpopular among majorities. So I think that's like something that I think a lot of people kind of realize, but they don't want to like think about it too much. I think if we look at the historical data, the best available data we have is from Gallup. So they've been asking people about their stance on whether the U.S. government should increase or decrease immigration since 1960s, if I remember correctly. And there we see actually a pretty gradual relaxation of attitudes, kind of people have been warming up for quite some time. And I can tell you like firsthand when I started doing some of this research, and let's say 5 years ago, 6 years ago, during the first Trump administration, sometimes people would ask me like, why, Alex, bother to do any of this? Because, people can imagine that immigration is going to be like gay marriage, basically, that people are just going to come to embrace it. The Gallup line, if you look at that famous chart, kind of supported that. But then just things reversed completely during the Biden administration. Basically the vast majority of folks were all of a sudden, against immigration, and including some of the kind of moderate Democrats as well. We know there was this shift among Hispanics and other minority populations to including immigration issues as well. Now with everything that's happening in Minneapolis and the increased enforcement and overreach, things are reverting again. And I worry that people are over-interpreting this as sort of like a signal that people are embracing immigration, but I don't think that's what it is, right? So from one perspective, you look at this kind of Gallup data, we see that people have been kind of ambivalent about immigration, skeptical, and kind of oscillating back and forth. But kind of not to paint everything in the kind of very pessimistic light. I think the good news is that I think the number of people who like kind of oppose immigration no matter what, so that's kind of what I call kind of categorical opposition. This can be due to like racism and things like that we know about. It's actually rarely more than like 10%, regardless of kind of data set and questions that you use. So these are the people who are like really agitated and opposed to the issue no matter what, but I think what it means is that the vast majority of folks are actually open to some kind of persuasion, right? And they have pretty nuanced opinions sometimes, right? It's just depending on the kind of the current policy reality and the events and things like that, they can be more or less skeptical. So I think, I think it's important to kind of not lose sight of the fact that immigration has never really been super popular, right? But I think there is a lot of room for optimism as well. And I can tell you that, I started as a comparativist. So if you look at some other countries and compare it to the US, actually, I think, relatively speaking, the US is much more pro-immigration, obviously, than most other countries in the rich world. So.
Oof, that is surprising to hear at this moment. So, it strikes me too that at this moment, it's so partisan. But I get the sense that that's not necessarily always been the case. Like, it's like, do you have that? Like, what is sort of like, how has it become such a party line issue?
Yeah, so I think it kind of connects to the idea of issue salience as well. So when, no one cared about immigration that much, so it's like, before the 90s or whatever. So it wasn't really a partisan issue because also, political parties and the elites were not talking about it much. I think the polarization, depending on kind of the data source you look at, I mean, it starts like in the 90s and consolidates in like early 2000s, and especially with the Obama presidency in the United States, actually abroad as well, approximately around the same time. And I think some people link it to those kind of very famous propositions in California to combat unauthorized immigration and things like that. Where, political parties locally in California Republicans were trying to make a stance, which, didn't work out well because California is not a Republican bastion anymore, as we know. But yeah, so basically since early 2000, immigration has become a, increasingly polarized issue by party and ideology. And now we know if you look, if you like are looking for like one single variable that predicts the biggest amount of variation in people's opinions, probably it would be party or ideology, depending on kind of the question you look at, right? And, we can talk more about it later. I think there's actually more agreement among Trump supporters or like Harris supporters than folks often acknowledge on certain kind of immigration sub-issues. But, if you just kind of talk about immigration in general, partisanship is probably going to be like the biggest thing that predicts all of it. Even more so if you kind of have like a good measure of like racism or whatever, I actually wouldn't be surprised that partisanship would be stronger than that. But I guess do you kind of find more fundamental, I think what it makes me think about is that immigration is not like inherently politically polarizing, because we know a lot of context within the US and other countries where actually parties agree on the issue, partisans agree on the issue, right? So I don't think it's necessarily, it has to be politically polarized, which I think, I think it's liberating to know that because I feel like sometimes I think we can imagine it's like this battle of like good and evil, depending on like, where you come from politically. You kind of think of the other side as like inherently wrong, right? But I think, at least it makes me think that, there is actually a lot of room for agreement among folks.
You mentioned two sort of sub-issues, and it makes me curious about like immigration is not one thing. And when we think about public opinion, it is very tempting to just refer to pro-immigration attitudes or anti-immigration attitudes. But does it seem like the public has a kind of refined opinion? Like
Yes.
people have quite refined. It's not just like never or always, but that people and sort of what are the like important features that carve out an individual's nuanced take on this?
Yeah, I think this is extremely important. And I think that's kind of what a lot of us mean. So it's not just immigration, other issues are complex as well. But I think in immigration specifically, it's very important. I think so there's this idea, there's almost like a conventional wisdom that like, if people say one thing on one kind of immigration question and then a different thing on a different immigration question, they're like confused or ambivalent. Like just to give you a very concrete example right now. So let's say you run a survey on different immigration questions, right? And you ask people about their opinion on ICE, about border security, about like immigration rights and admissions. And and I feel like a lot of folks right now would say that they want to abolish ICE, right? But then they would still say that they want to have some kind of elaborate border security. And maybe they would say that maybe we should restrict immigration further, right? So kind of according to this traditional understanding, we could, if we just sum up all those kind of question and variables in the survey and do some kind of index, right? Those people are going to be in between, or we can say they're confused, ambivalent, there's some kind of measurement error. But I think actually, if you think about it, those stances are meaningful. They make sense, right? I think right now, given everything that's going on, I think it's a pretty coherent position to think that ICE, if not, should be abolished, but like, restructured and reformed, right? But at the same time, people still want enforcement and be safe in their communities and all that, right? So I think when you kind of look into more detail about what people think about the issue, actually, you have a very interesting, combination that you can see among different folks. And, the way I think about it is that I think for most people, they don't really think about immigration as just, again, as you said, either or, right? I think in general, again, it's just like 10% of people who are like opposed to everything, right? And by the way, incidentally, I think it's also oftentimes overlooked is that we also have about 10% of people in the US and other countries that are like almost full-blown open border supporters, right? For either like humanitarian or libertarian reasons or some other moral convictions. People basically would, pick like the most pro-immigration option on all possible items unconditionally, right? So this is also something that I think is important to keep in mind, right? But I think the vast majority of folks, like, again, depending on the data you look at, like 70 to 80%, they would be, their opinion would be dependent on like what particular questions you ask and the combinations thereof. So one of my colleagues, Mark Helbling at the University of Mannheim, so he did some really great research in Germany recently, kind of trying to kind of look at this complexity in more detail. And say what he found was actually pretty striking to me. So like, in Germany, for instance, if you explicitly pose trade-offs between, combinations of different policies on enforcement, rights, asylum, things like that, he finds that people who we consider restrictionists, like anti-immigration folks, right? So actually those folks can be willing to accept more immigration if we also stipulate that those policies can be more selective, while, people who are pro-immigration, actually, if you tell them that you can have policies that increase immigrant rights in terms of, their access to social welfare, things like that, they actually can be willing to be more restrictive in a way, so accept fewer immigrants, right? So it's a very kind of interesting thing to think about, right? So again, so it kind of tells you that it's not just either or, right? And it's also, I think it's interesting to think about how those different sub-issues or constellation of issues comes about in different places, because again, it's not set in stone. There's no inherent way to like divide all the different policy issues into like a coherent mix of different things. So like, in some countries, immigration is a part of some kind of justice department, and people are more likely to think about it as some kind of kind of social justice situation. Right now in the US, especially since 9/11, immigration has been under the Department of Homeland Security, right? So a lot of people who are much smarter than me have written about like, the securitization of the issue and things like that, which I think makes sense given that immigration basically is a part of national security in a way, in many respects, right? So I think I don't think there is this one way to divide that, but I do think that people have pretty nuanced opinions on various immigration issues, right? And basically saying that, enforcement has to be lawful, right? And saying that immigration should be restricted are not like opposite opinions in a ways. And I think it's pretty logical for people to reconcile those. And I don't think we should treat those as like ambivalent or confused or whatever.
I wonder too, so I'm going rogue a little bit on this, but these seem like fairly abstract attitudes for people. And I think about this a lot, that like how much of this is about people's opinions who have no direct experience with immigration systems or policy. Like it's not personally relevant. And so sometimes I could sort of imagine that some of this, you could call it nuanced opinion, is really just like, if you ask me this question, I go, oh, interesting. And I don't really have a stored response for that, but I just haven't really entertained all facets of the question. So do we know how stable this kind of constellation of specific policy attitudes is, as opposed to the stability of just the more general pro-anti-immigration stance itself?
We know a little bit. I'm working on it, but it's longitudinal data. So if you want to get at stability, what you want to do is you have to ask the same people over time. And it's extremely difficult, right? Right now, the survey industry is not doing well. We had a lot of issues with like, just response rates, survey retentions, even before like AI, and now the AI is coming to change the world, right? So longitudinal studies are not easy, and so especially if you want to like do a study with a bunch of very specific questions, like immigration is a certain issue, it like basically costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you also have the attrition problems where, you might have like a really good sample to start with. And people say that, yes, of course, I'm going to follow up in a year, especially if you pay me like $20 or whatever. But then people just disappear, life happens and they move or whatever. So these things are not easy. But to the extent that we have the longitudinal evidence, we see that people's kind of basic immigration opinions are pretty stable. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough evidence to see whether the constellations are pretty stable. So that's something that I'm trying to work on. But I've done, actually a lot of my research kind of goes back to this, kind of one of my first papers that I've done with some of my colleagues, looking at all those kind of longitudinal data on immigration and showing that if you treat immigration as this kind of one-dimensional pro-immigration, anti-immigration thing, it actually seems very, very stable, which was surprising to us because, again, if you look at the discourse and the kind of research, I think a lot of folks can assume that people kind of go back and forth depending on framing, depending on like how immigration is presented and the events happening outside. But, just basically to give you like some numbers, to put some numbers in it, right? So in some of those panels, like I think it was in Switzerland, they had a very good household panel where they ask several immigration questions, basically, even sometimes starting as early when people like 18 or something. So like in high school or whatever. And basically for the vast majority of folks, from 70 to 90%, depending on how you count, basically their stance, whether they're pro-immigration or anti-immigration, is basically unchanged after like 10 years, right? So the only thing that I think is more stable than that is like partisanship in the United States of America, right? So I think what it made us think about is what are those really what are the predictors are of immigration attitudes in general. And I think what it means is that it's probably not about those kind of circumstantial framing or information campaigns, or even like a lot of those longitudinal data sets that we looked at, they were happening when Brexit happened, when Trump happened, when the refugee crisis happened, and it seemed like for most people, basically their opinion toward those particular issues was dependent on their kind of initial stance, which is probably related to their kind of predispositions, or kind of, again, depending on how you view those issues. I don't think we're going to be able to kind of resolve those things right now in this podcast, right? But like, it can be genetic in part. It can be like early socialization, your kind of early experiences and things like that. So basically, your personality traits effectively, whether you're like more or less ethnocentric, right? And so basically, depending on those things that happen early in life, or even before you were born, effectively, right, you are just predisposed to be more or less pro-immigration, right? But I think, obviously, those events that happened and the messaging can still, change the salience of the issue, how important the issue is to your vote, right? I think that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind, right? So even before Trump, right, a lot of people were concerned about immigration in this country, right? And it's not like Trump made people more xenophobic or anything, right? He was very masterful at like channeling those concerns that haven't really been channeled before through like major parties, either the Republican or the Democratic Party. And he was very successful in making the issue salient, which is actually not easy to do. Right. A lot of people have tried to demonize migrants for electoral gains all across the world for many years. And a lot of them failed. Right. I think we should definitely give it to President Trump for being successful at this. I mean, you have to have like a lot of charisma. You have to have a lot of kind of name recognition, prominence, things like that. It's like it was a very kind of successful combination of factors, for his electoral from the electoral perspective. But it worked, right? But I think it's, again, important to keep in mind that I don't think I've seen any evidence that Trump himself made people more xenophobic. I think one thing that I should mention, and I haven't looked at it in too much detail, but there's some really good research done by Vicente Valentim at the in the University of Madrid, I believe. So he has looked at the idea of social norms, and what he shows in a lot of his research that Trump and many other kind of populist leaders, what they do effectively is that they change social norms. And that's pretty much what we see now is happening across the country, right? Is that back in the day, like as early as, in 2015, maybe some of those xenophobic remarks, right, or actions or behaviors, people might have felt them or believed those things, but it was just not cool to talk about it or mention it in public. Right now, I think at least among like strong Trump supporters, right, it's something that people feel okay talking about, which, might be meaningful for like real world behavior and events and things like that.
Yeah, that is one aspect of your work that I really have responded to is and it resonates. I mean, I'm very interested in the strength of attitudes beyond just what those attitudes are. And so, yeah, there's like, it seems intuitive that the way you make change is to change people's minds. But what you're highlighting is that another vehicle for change is to take the things people already think, but make them seem more important, or get them to act on them, or get them to talk about them. And so I know you have some work showing that this is possible, like as a communication strategy. Are there ways that we might not necessarily be getting people to become more pro-immigration or anti-immigration, but just lean on the attitudes they already have more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, this is like a key thing that a lot of people are missing when it comes to the persuasion efforts, right? So again, kind of going back to the most pro-immigration moment we had in U.S. history, at least according to Gallup, right? So interestingly, if you look at that kind of historical trends on immigration opinion, the most kind of pro-immigration snapshot happened in April 2020, just after, the start of the pandemic, where, a lot of people were worried that actually the global pandemic is going to make people very xenophobic. And we did have like, a surge in like hate crimes and things like that. But in terms of attitudes, actually, things have been pretty stable. But I think even in that moment, basically what we saw is that, yes, it's true that for the first time in US history, more people said that they wanted to increase immigration rather than decrease it, right? But if you look at like what those people cared about, right? And we know from a lot of kind of other data in ANES and some other surveys, is that among those who said that they liked immigration, who wanted to increase it, who wanted to give immigrants more rights, they actually cared about other issues more, right? And so it's the one thing that I kind of document in some of my research is that across different contexts, people who dislike immigration for whatever reason, they tend to care so much more about it, in terms of kind of voting, political behavior and things like that. And just, kind of seeking information and like posting on Twitter about it. Right. I think the issue here is that, let's say right now, if you're a progressive person in the United States, right, there are just so many important things to care about, like climate change, abortion, AI, right? And so immigration might not just be on top of people's minds oftentimes, even though, kind of if you ask them and put them on a spot, they would say, of course, immigrants should be able to come and things like that. Right. But it's just not going to be something that kind of determines what they do about their daily lives. While if you look at the kind of more conservative side, I think immigration was a much more kind of, like an arch issue that united a lot of folks. I mean, obviously, a lot of it had to do with the realignment and the President Trump and his agenda and things like that. But we also see it outside of the US where, we didn't really have people like Trump. Right. And really, like, as long as immigration is somewhat salient, I find that people who dislike immigration usually care more about it. I don't think necessarily that it's like inherent, right? I think there are a lot of interesting things to think about. I think it's just in general, I think it might have something to do with this idea of kind of loss aversion, that like kind of threat looms larger than the gains of immigration. If something bad happens, like like an immigrant killed someone, it's like a much bigger thing than like, just many immigrants going about their daily lives and contributing to their communities, right? That's not news, right? And so people I think they kind of take those benefits for granted. And when something happens, it's kind of becomes a thing that people care about. So there's this kind of inherent, maybe negativity bias of some sort. But I do think that to the extent that you can do some kind of campaigning on trying to increase the salience of the issue among some folks, if this makes sense kind of politically or whatever, for practical reasons, I think it might work. So I've done some research where I was able to increase the salience of immigration among kind of people who are already kind of predispositionally pro-immigration by telling them about how it connects to other things they care about, right? So for instance, again, if you care about healthcare, kind of housing crisis, right? So you can emphasize that at least some immigration policies can help with that, right? So bring people who can work, who can help build and things like that. So it's basically the idea that you can inform people, right? So you can you have to provide a convincing narrative, right? But it's effectively about kind of information campaigns, which I think from my understanding, and actually I'm curious about kind of your take on that, is that information and like framing or priming or whatever, it's something that, you can obviously forget or ignore information, right? But you cannot like unlearn it, right? While I feel like framing, the problem with like framing stuff is that like you can always reframe things and it just becomes a matter of who has like the biggest microphone or, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder if also part of the trouble is that if importance is higher among anti-immigration contingents, then that sort of filters into that megaphone, right? And so like it becomes now a rallying cry in a way that it maybe isn't as likely to just become that. And so it's then less about the stance or the importance, but ultimately it's about reach, right? And so one half of this debate has more reach because more people are willing to talk about it or are motivated to talk about it. And so I've thought a lot more recently about just like reach of a message. I spend so much time thinking about the psychological processes that make a message resonate or not. But sometimes it's about which message got out to the most people. And in a dense information environment, that may have more pull on public opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that I think we should mention, because I know some listeners might be wondering, is that I think there's important distinction to be made about relative versus absolute preferences, right? Because we've been talking about how like stable immigration attitudes are, but at the same time, as we mentioned in the very beginning, like if you look at Gallup, it kind of went back and forth, especially recently, right? So I think so the Gallup question and like a lot of kind of other questions that we ask in the public opinion surveys, they're kind of relative, right? They ask about whether you want something to increase or decrease, when you want more of welfare or less of welfare, more of government spending, less of government spending. Those questions are very easy to ask, and we have kind of more evidence and data on that, right? And those questions are more likely to kind of oscillate depending on kind of what's happening out there about, kind of what the current government is and what they're doing, right? And there's this idea by my colleague Chris Bleason at Texas, who came up with this notion of thermostatic politics, right? And it's the idea that like basically people respond to what the government is doing, right? And they sort of like a thermostat. They want to like indicate whether what they think is happening is like kind of feels comfortable, right? And if it doesn't, then they say that we want more or we want less, right? And then the government is responding to that, right? And so the idea is actually that, sort of like it helps to create this public opinion and policy feedback loop, right? Where, if the government is overreaching, people would, complain about it effectively, right? And then the government is going to stop doing it. I think, to a certain extent, that's something that is happening right now in immigration. Again, things are changing very fast, so I don't want to make any predictions. But I do think that to the extent that there is some connection between what the government, even the current government, is doing in public opinion, I think we can definitely see that to the extent people are warming up to immigration again is because of the government overreach. That even like a lot of moderate and like, kind of Republicans are feeling as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this feels like a good time to take up the idea of like, how do we pitch immigration in a way that makes more waves, right? And sort of like, how do we design policies that resonate with like what people are actually looking for? And you've done some work that I think raises this interesting, to me, surprising pocket of the public who is opposed to freer immigration policy. And so I wonder if you could just talk about what you call the altruist's dilemma and what it shows us about sort of where these kinds of immigration attitudes can come from.
Yeah. And that kind of to finish my earlier thought, right? So those relative preferences, they change in terms of like, depending on what the government does, right? But I don't think that necessarily means that people absolute preferences change or like in terms of what they really want from immigration, right? And so what I'm trying to do in my book is actually to see what they want from immigration by looking at their kind of underlying preferences. And kind of one thing that I'm doing there, which is somewhat different from what other folks have done, because, when it comes to immigration, obviously there's a lot of research on kind of racism and racial bias and, just kind of different prejudice types that people have, which, I fully acknowledge they exist, right? But what I try to kind of figure out is what happens to this idea of kind of pro-social attitudes and behaviors, right? So we know from a lot of research that actually a lot of people are not complete selfish egoists, right? They're actually willing to oftentimes help others at a personal cost, right? And if that's true, I thought it was kind of weird that, we still have this very high opposition to immigration, right? Because again, kind of the conventional wisdom, I think, which kind of intuitively makes sense, that if you have this diehard kind of altruist person, humanitarian, they would be like, be willing to help those vulnerable folks who are trying to flee violence or adversity in their home countries, right? But that's not what we see in the data. And in fact, one thing that I do in the very beginning of the book is that I show that, if we look at the best measures of those kind of altruistic attitudes and behaviors in terms of, people donating money to charity, volunteering, some kind of, even kind of attitudinal measures of whether they think helping others is a good thing. Those things actually surprisingly are not related to immigration support, or sometimes actually go in the opposite direction, which I thought it was interesting. But basically it made me think that, maybe people who are altruistic for some kind of, again, either socialization or genetic reasons, they maybe have not necessarily have like the world as a whole in mind, right? And so basically that's brought me to this idea of altruist dilemma, as you mentioned, that basically for folks who are altruistic for one way or a reason or another, it seems that they tend to actually be also the people who prioritize their compatriots. So obviously, and I kind of talk a little bit about the history of nationalism and things like that. Kind of long story short, right? So people had various different kind of in-groups throughout history, right? Even now, everyone is a part of various kind of in-groups. We have this, big idea of social identity theory and things like that. But I think when it comes to politics and national politics in particular, it seems like right now we live in a world of nation states where most people kind of think of it as, governments prioritizing their interests in terms of citizens and compatriots. So it's just something that kind of institutionally structured, right? We see American flags everywhere. It's just kind of something that makes sense. I'm trying not to like make a moral judgment about that and trying to kind of just, empirically document how it works, even if you kind of personally disagree for whatever reason, right? But basically what I do show, and I think that's kind of one of the key pieces of evidence in my book, I have this, what I call an altruist dilemma game, which is kind of similar to a lot of kind of dictator games that folks do in economics, where, basically we can try to reveal people's sense of altruism or prosociality by giving them a real, sum of money of some sort, right? And then telling that they can either keep it or share it with others. And we know from a lot of research that happened before is that a lot of people actually decide to share their prize or whatever, regardless of whether it's like $1, by the way, or like $100 or whatever. A lot of people actually are altruistic this way, right? And because it happens in an anonymous way, you cannot really say that there are some kind of social concerns or whatever. So it's interesting. I mean, there are a lot of kind of you can talk about like behavioral genetic reasons or psychology about that, but I think kind of what we observe right now is that a lot of people decide to share money with others, even though they don't see any benefit from that, right? And so what I did there, which was sort of kind of a little methodological innovation, is to force people to decide whether they want to share their prize with domestic charities or global charities. And it was matched so that basically people had to decide, for instance, between global or international Red Cross and domestic Red Cross. So I don't have to deal with those concerns about like charity recognitions or whatever. And so basically what I found, and I did this both in the UK and the US with very, very similar results, I should say, where, a very significant number of folks decided to share their price with the charities. I think it was like 30 to 40%. But among those, the vast majority were sharing with domestic charities, right? So basically you have this, just evidence that, to the extent that people are altruistic, it's mostly kind of channeled in this kind of domestic direction towards their compatriots. And basically what I show is that those, again, genuine altruists who decide to incur personal cost and not get that price, that was a real prize, by the way. And I should say that as a part of those experiments, actually have donated a lot of money to charities on people's behalf. So I still get like random envelopes from like one of the charities that I donated, because like once they have your email or whatever, it's just you're always
on the list.
Yeah, you're always on the list. Yeah, and it's like I did it like in the UK as well, so I'm also like getting stuff from like British charities. Yeah. So, and then so what I show is basically that people who are prioritizing their compatriots in an altruistic way, those are the people who actually are more skeptical about immigration, more so than like selfish people, which is somewhat surprising. But
that's the part that I've really responded to. And I for some reason I didn't think the game let you do that, but I think that's really important. It's not just people who give money domestically are more skeptical of immigration than people who give money globally. They're also more skeptical of immigration than people who chose to be selfish.
Yeah.
So relative to selfishness, altruism was associated with greater immigration skepticism, assuming we're talking about people who were domestically altruistic.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. And I should say, that's the first part. And the second part, and I think that's the key, and that's, you can if you're like a pro-immigration person, you can view it with some kind of pessimism, right? But the optimistic part here is that the exact same people who are as or more anti-immigration than like people who don't donate money to any charities, they become more pro-immigration when it comes to specific immigration proposals that are kind of, by design or explicitly beneficial to the receiving country, right? And so I asked the same exact people, like a follow-up question, whether they would be willing to support increasing immigration if, let's say, it selects immigrants based on their contributions through education, skills, things like that, or greater taxation of immigrants and, a few other kind of policy proposals. And those altruistic nationalists, parochial altruists, or people who prioritize and want to help compatriots, right, they suddenly become actually more, relatively speaking, more pro-immigration than those people who are selfish, right? Which makes me think again that those people are not just like racist or xenophobes, right? They really kind of prioritize their compatriots. And for many different reasons, they believe that immigration might not be optimal for them, or at least the way it's currently conducted, right? But they're open to changing their minds depending on the particular policy issues at stake, right? It's not like, I think it's important to visit, it's not like they have become persuaded that immigration is good all of a sudden, and then they change their mind because of some kind of information campaign or a piece of information that they lacked, right? It's not like I told them that you thought that immigration is bad for your compatriots and you opposed it, but actually immigration is good, so you should support it, right? I don't think that would work. Actually, in fact, one thing that I show in my book is that it generally doesn't work. But I said hypothetically, if there was this policy that, some countries like Canada are implementing, would you support it? They say yes.
Yeah. So what do those policies look like? So it seems like what this is teeing up is that there's a way to make immigration more palatable by highlighting its kind of internal benefits to your, the other folks that are already in your country, right? And you refer to this too as demonstrably beneficial policies. Like, so what does that really look like? Like, what are the kinds of proposals that would resonate with folks who are not unilaterally opposed to immigration, but for whatever reason are skeptical that it brings anything good to their nation?
Yeah, no, this is key, and you asked really good questions, I should say. No, but I mean, that's actually, one thing that I realized after I published some of this data as a part of like a journal article. It was like a part of my dissertation. I realized that most people interpret it as a form of kind of political communication advice, right? So if it's true, and if you believe my evidence that people care about the national interest, then we should just emphasize it more, right? So I don't think it's wrong, and I think it's still important to inform people in a democracy. But I also think that it's actually not true that immigration is always beneficial, right? And again, people might exaggerate the cost. There's a lot of misinformation on the issue. But I do think that, it's not just about ignorance, right? And I also actually have a paper where I show that it's not the case that pro-immigration people are necessarily much more informed about the issue, right? So basically, again, hypothetically, if we imagine a world where everyone is fully informed, which is not possible, right? In a real world democracy, people have better things to do than learn about policy, right? Even in that hypothetical world, people are not going to be fully on board with immigration, right? Because they have different values and they might support or oppose immigration for different reasons, right? And that kind of brought me to this idea of demonstrable benefits, which is basically about, policies that are explicitly and straightforwardly beneficial to receiving countries that, most people can understand without being told, and regardless of where they come from politically or in terms of their education. Basically, if your case for immigration and the true information hinges on some kind of econometric model published in an academic journal that only a PhD in economics can understand, that's not going to be helpful. I mean, it's good to know. I think that this research is very important. I've done some of it and I rely on that in my own work, right? But it's just not going to resonate with the vast majority of voters, right? So it really is about ensuring that your immigration policies are understandable to normal people, right? Including, and I cannot emphasize enough, people with conservative predispositions and no higher education, right? That's the key. I think skilled immigration is the most kind of prototypical, demonstrably beneficial policy like that. You really, and I've done tons of experiments, and a lot of my colleagues have done it before me. We know there's this, there's this paper by Heinmuller and Hopkins, The Hidden Immigration Consensus, which shows that, basically people across the political spectrum support skilled immigration. We had the same data from before the 2024 election that the vast majority, I think 85% of Harris and Trump supporters supported increasing skilled immigration in the U.S., right? And we know that now is actually not happening, despite the fact that that was the preference of Trump supporters, right? And the reason for that is because you really don't have to explain why skilled immigration is good. People understand intuitively that if you invite a doctor from India, even an ethnically different country, right? So one kind of key finding there that even, I should say that some of my colleagues disagree to what extent this preference is fully genuine. It has some kind of status prejudice in it, hidden in some way or another, right? But like people understand that if you invite a doctor, an engineer, or any kind of highly paid professional, they're going to be paying a lot of taxes, right? They're going to contribute to their communities, and they're probably not going to have any integration issues because they speak the language, not to make all this money and things like that, right? So you don't really have to explain that, right? I think when it comes to other forms of immigration, like lower skilled immigration, you really have to talk about a variety of different you talk about indirect fiscal benefits, right? It might be the case that, if you invite a lot of lower skilled workers, right, they might not necessarily contribute more in terms of taxes than they consume in benefits, right? But there's this argument, which, I find convincing as an immigration researcher, that when you invite a lot of lower skilled folks from abroad and they take all those positions of nannies, kind of house care, home care, elder care, they free up time of native born women, for instance, and those folks are more likely then to go up higher in the career ladder and stuff, right? It makes sense, immigrants also consume more. They consume locally, they buy groceries, they do all the kinds of things, right? But you really have to explain those things, and those things are contingent on various models and assumptions that people might disagree with and misunderstand and things like that, right? So so basically you can think of demonstrably beneficial policies like a higher bar, right? So it's not just a policy that is beneficial according to some kind of estimate from an academic paper, which again might be more or less realistic, but it's something that people can intuitively understand. So I would say, apart from this idea, my biggest intervention is that what I'm trying to show is that it's not just about skilled immigration, which we already knew about, right? I think you can also imagine how those demonstrably beneficial policies can be related to some forms of work immigration when it's about, let's say, targeting those well-documented labor shortages in certain sectors. And I really have to be careful about that because I know that some people even distrust the idea of labor shortages in general, because also they have this incentive. Some employers say that their sector is experiencing a shortage, right? And they need more lower skilled labor and cheap labor in their particular business, right? But I think we know that certain things elder care in the US, for instance, a well-documented research area where we really need more people, more labor, that, we know that, you, even if you pay more money, realistically, I don't know, $30, $40, $50 an hour, you're not going to have enough Americans do that, right? And so, so when you have those well-documented shortages, that can also be demonstrably beneficial because people need those migrants, right? And they see their work, firsthand. It's also about immediate relative immigration and reunification, right? So, people complain about chain immigration on the right sometimes, but when it comes to immediate family migration, immigration of spouses, really, if you talk to the staunchest Trump supporter, they acknowledge that, of course, American citizens have the full right to invite their foreign spouses. Trump famously did it himself a couple of times, right? So it's just really not an issue, right? And I've done some experiments where you can see that people are completely unaware that even in this slam dunk case of spousal migration that no one is opposing, right? It still takes several years of legal filings and stuff. It takes several $1,000s of, application fees and potentially legal fees, right? People on the conservative side who are generally skeptical about immigration, they're this doesn't make any sense, right? So why do we do that? It doesn't make any sense at all. And so, so you have this, I mean, you can also think of it as a broader thing. People understand that, for instance, when you invite skilled workers, right, oftentimes they have their families, right? And you have to invite those folks too. And, it's actually not like, I think some people make like a huge deal about it on the kind of restrictionist end, but like it's also, there's a lot of correlation between what you do and what your spouse does, right? So if you invite a skilled worker, their spouse is probably also going to be pretty skilled, right? So I don't think it's like a big of a trade-off there either. It's also about like select refugee pathways. So again, so kind of one themes of the book is that unfortunately, depending especially where you come from, if you predominantly care about like humanitarian migration, right, it's not popular among majorities, especially if you do it for humanitarian reasons. But I think there's certain policies that can still help a lot of folks. So I've been like really obsessed with this idea of private refugee sponsorship, which they spearheaded in Canada, where basically the idea is that instead of government spending taxpayer money on like resettling refugees, you have willing citizens spending their own dime on helping folks who they know. Usually actually happens through like churches and some kind of conservative organizations, right? So it's something that like addresses a lot of those concerns about like refugees draining the welfare system or like taxpayers' money, right? It's really like channeling what people want to do as well with their lives, right? So a lot of, sometimes you go like on Twitter and someone like says something pro immigration, and then the kind of the knee-jerk reaction from restrictionists is that like, why don't you house them in your own house, or like in your but like the problem is that a lot of people, in fact, when we have the Welcome Corps program in the US that got accidentally shut down, I would say, you had tens of thousands of Americans saying, yes, I want to invite those folks on my own dime and help them. But the government is saying now that it's illegal, right? Again, so like, I would love to invite someone to my house, especially, by the way, if they can pay rent, right? But it's illegal, right? So you have that situation. Yeah, so I think, demonstrably beneficial policies can be broad, but the larger point here that I'm trying to make is that, again, it's not just about informing people about the current policies that exist that we think are beneficial, but also actually changing those policies or coming up with new policies, right? Someone actually had to come up with this idea of private refugee sponsorship, right, and establish it institutionally. It takes a lot of work, right? Again, it's not just about trying to change the narrative about what refugees are and what they do. Is actually changing their reality, which I think by itself can change the narrative, right? I think in Canada, if they didn't have this program, which by the way, we settled like, I don't know, like 500,000 refugees or something since 1980s or whatever, right? So if they didn't have this program, obviously like a lot of fewer people would be helped, right? And also I feel like the politics of humanitarian migration would be much more contentious than it is now.
So I think a lot about what happens when we take issues that people moralize and think of in terms of this lens of like fundamental right and wrong, and then we force them into this instrumental cost benefit. And I love your book has the dedication for love of country and cost benefit analysis, and it just sort of highlights to me what I worry sometimes, like an ardent activist, like these folks who are on these surveys, yes, down the board, open borders. Is there some sort of reaction of like, but why do I have to make this about what's good for you, right? Like, isn't this just the right thing to do? So I'm just curious, do you have any sense of, one, what people's reactions to this kind of cost-benefit analysis are from that vantage point, or like, how much do you care that people might go, well, do we even have to do this?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about it. I mean, I should say that's probably one of the strongest reactions that I've gotten to my book from like some of the folks who disagree strongly. I clearly am a pretty pragmatic person, not very ideological, but I understand that people can be different. And I think that's kind of my pitch to people who are more moralistic about those things, is that kind of understand that even if you have the best possible message, you're not going to be able to bring everyone on your side. We have a lot of evidence in history on that, right? And also, I think I should say that some people argue that there must be some division of labor, right? So maybe it's a good thing to have some people who are like uncompromising and they're like, just trying to beat this drum on open borders or closed borders. But it's also important to realize that then you also have people who beat the drum on the opposite side, right? What I want to see is actual genuine progress on the issue, right? Where, more people are benefiting. even if it means that you have to compromise, right? Yeah, and I think it's just maybe reframing what it means to compromise, right? It doesn't mean that you have to like abandon your humanitarian principles, right? It's about just coming up with things that more people would agree are good and implementing them so more people can benefit in a democracy, right? Because I think it's also important to realize, at least in my work, I focus on democracies. Maybe it might be different like in autocratic regimes, right? But we live in a country or countries where, you really, if you're an adult, you have your right to vote for people you agree with politically, right? And then you would always have some kind of combination of coalitions that disagree with each other, right? And immigration, I think, is again, it's not an easy issue, right? I think that my problem with immigration is that, like, it seems like, politically is an easy issue. People have an opinion about it, right? But actually, it's a very technical, complex issue where you have a lot of trade-offs. And I think people should be more honest about those, even if you believe that, like I do, that like immigration can be a really good thing and can be much more open and streamlined than it is now in most places, right? I also think, just again, empirically and historically, we see that, our attempts to persuade people in a moralistic way that is not very compromising have failed, right? I don't think that immigration politics now is better or healthier than it was 20 or 30 years ago, unfortunately. So again, it's just like, so it seems like it hasn't helped. Again, people might disagree on the like margins and the merit here, but like I do think that, the existing practices of persuasion have not been very successful in this regard. Yeah, and I think again, I think it's important to kind of again, even if you are not pragmatic as a person, but also like if you do have this goal of like helping folks, right? Again, and I think that's kind of what made me very convinced about this, and I think that's kind of one of the most convincing parts of my book is this comparison between Sweden and Canada, right? Because Canada is like in your face, has like a very national interest approach, right? Which a lot of humanitarian activists criticize, right? But I think because it resonates with folks and the voters, and it makes politics less contentious and polarizing on the issue, I think they have enough political capital to admit more refugees and asylum seekers, actually, because they just admit so many migrants of all kinds in general, right? Than a place like Sweden that is predominantly about humanitarian immigration, right? So again, I don't think that necessarily everyone has to be like pragmatic or moderate or whatever on the issue, but I do think that at some point you have to, kind of step back and realize what is actually helping people, right? And also be honest about the fact that, again, some of those things are pretty complex. I think, again, immigration has a lot of moral and empirical trade-offs that are not going to be resolved. I highly recommend there is a really good set of papers done by the European University Institute in their Migration Policy Center. So they talk about different moral dilemmas of immigration, like a whole series, where they talk about issues that, that like a lot of kind of progressive and left-wing philosophers even like disagree on. And, sometimes it's really not like clear what to do. Like, just my favorite example is like this idea of like, not allowing refugees to work. There are actually a lot of progressive pro-immigration arguments to say that that's not a good idea to do that because those people are vulnerable and we're going to be exploiting them, right? But when you do that, effectively what you do is that you are creating those perceptions of refugees leeching on the system by default, right? So I don't know. I feel like sometimes even if you take this kind of unabashedly pro-immigration view, it's actually still unclear what exactly you should do in terms of policy design. So I feel like what I would encourage people to do is like maybe pay less attention to words and the rhetoric that people use and more attention to actually the details and their consequences. Again, I don't think anyone or everyone has to be a consequentialist, but I think you cannot just completely ignore those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you want to tell people about the Substack?
Yeah. So highly, if you like what I'm saying here, I started a Substack recently where I'm trying to follow up on these themes. So obviously, you can only do so much in one book, right? Everything depends on the context. immigration policy landscape is changing very rapidly. So I'm trying to follow up on that in my Substack and talk about kind of the details, in particular case studies and things like that. So yeah, if you Google Popular by Design, that's what it's called.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it. I think it's an important sort of grounded look at, as you said, what can be such a complicated set of issues. And I appreciate you doing the work to sort it all out.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, that does it for another episode of Opinion Science. Thank you so much to Alex Kustov for taking the time to talk about his work. You can, as always, check out the episode webpage for a link to his website and the research we talked about. His book, again, is In Our Interest: How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. And go subscribe to his Substack, Popular by Design. For more about this show, be sure to hop on over to opinionsciencepodcast.com, where you'll find all the past episodes of this show. The intro to this week's show was from episode 57, Media, Norms, and Social Change, with Suhad Murar. Go listen to that one, too, if you haven't already. I still think it's great. Okay, subscribe to this show, leave a review. You know what to do by now. This isn't your first podcast experience, I'm guessing anyway, but if it is, wow, thanks for choosing Opinion Science as your first foray into podcasts as a medium. Happy to have you. But I'm all out of things to say now, so thank you for being here, and I'll see you back next month for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.